per poder tenir una transició a un món, encara que sigui una mica diferent o bastant diferent, però sostenible, i sobretot poder treballar en positiu per millorar totes les coses junts. El Santi Sabater és l'organitzador d'aquest acte i a qui vull agrair moltíssim tota la feina que fa, perquè són tota una sèrie d'activitats associades al Premi Ramon Margalef que organitzen amb estudiants, amb visites in situ a diferents àrees d'estudi, etc. I moltíssimes gràcies, Santi, per tota la feina que feu. I bé, jo no em vull entretenir més, ja li he fet una sèrie de preguntes al doctor Malhi abans, perquè tots necessitem molt que ens expliquin més coses sobre l'Ecological Restoration, sobre HOP, sobre què podem fer o quin escenari podem tenir endavant i sobre les possibilitats que tenim de contribuir tots plegats a millorar l'escenari. També m'ha comentat que serà present en el COP30, que tenim ara al mes de novembre, i bé, és evident que persones com ell són imprescindibles en aquestes reunions també. So I'm not going much further. Thank you so much. We have such a great honor to have you here, and we will look forward to your presentation and to the discussion we will have later on. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Ara passaré la paraula a Santi Sabater, que farà la introducció i la presentació.
Moltes gràcies, Rosina. Les gràcies les dono al Ramon Margalef, que ens ha fet que puguem estar aquí avui, que ens ha deixat del seu llegat i que volem continuar després de tants anys. Clar, per molta gent jove senten el nom de Margalef i veuen l'edifici, però per als que vam tenir-lo i hem treballat, o bé que vam estar al mateix departament o bé en algun moment hi vam interaccionar, va generar molt d'interès, ens va fer créixer, ens va fer créixer en el món de l'ecologia i tenia aquesta visió tan fascinant, imaginativa, tan transversal i integradora de la biosfera, on sempre hi posava els humans a dins, deia una de les coses aquesta de man and biosphere, ell deia això no pot ser, el man està dins de la biosfera. I en aquest cas que tenim en Yadvinder, ell és professor d'Ecosystem Science a la Universitat d'Oxford i també fundador del Center for Tropical Ecology, Tropical Forests, i també professor visitant a l'Imperial College of London i podríem dir moltes coses perquè té un llarg recorregut en aquest món de la recerca i muntar moltes coses, moltes coses relacionades amb el coneixement dels ecosistemes i com funcionen. La seva recerca aborda qüestions fonamentals sobre aquesta funció i diversitat i la dinàmica dels ecosistemes i a més els resultats són molt rellevants i ara parlàvem fa un moment de què podem fer en aquest món tan canviant, però de cara a aquests coneixements són rellevants per la conservació i l'adaptació al canvi climàtic. Un dels reptes que tenim amb el canvi climàtic és que encara no ha parat de canviar. Llavors, quan projectes com evolucionen els sistemes, clar, dius, si el clima ja l'haguéssim estabilitzat, doncs sabríem on hem d'anar. Però el problema que tenim és que tot això encara continua canviant. I aquest és un dels grans reptes quan plantegem com fer front a aquests reptes del canvi climàtic i aquests canvis del món. També és cofundador de la xarxa d'inventaris forestals de l'Amazona, el Rainfor. Ha desenvolupat una xarxa internacional de recerca Ecosystem Monitoring Network, on es recopilen dades sobre la funció dels ecosistemes en diversos llocs de recerca dels tròpics. Ell ha treballat molt als tròpics, però no només als tròpics, ha generat una xarxa molt centrada als tròpics, però també en altres àrees del planeta. Avui, com veieu en el programa, ens parla del Energy Flow as a Way of Understanding Ecosystem Change and Nature Recovery. I després, com veieu al programa, també tindrem un col·loqui on comptarem amb ell, amb en Yadvinder, amb la Imma Oliveres, amb l'Emma Cebrián i la Beatriz Uguí, per una mica després establir des de les seves pròpies experiències i amb el que haurà explicat en Yadvinder, generar un diàleg i després l'obrirem a la resta. Quan ell va plantejar aquest tema i va parlar de l'energia, els que sou doctorants, si és que n'hi ha, espero que sí, uns quants, i si no, doncs esperem que a la tarda també pugueu tornar aquí a l'aula magna, perquè hem quedat a les 4 per poder tenir un contacte proper i qüestions que vulgueu amb ell. Però, a banda d'això, quan em va proposar el tema, dic, home, això em va dir el tema que parlaré de l'energia i el flux de l'energia i llavors dic, això el Margalef era un dels seus temes. Quan ell va voler introduir sobretot aquest paper tan important de l'energia exosomàtica, que podríem dir que determina com es distribueixen els diferents biomes a la biosfera, però també és causa de pertorbacions i pot canviar les seves estructures, dona suport a la producció primària, això ell insistia molt, i també intervé en l'organització de l'espai. Ell en aquest esquema veieu aquí la humanitat, que a part de la dissipació de l'energia exosomàtica que fa funcionar els ecosistemes, ella va dir que teníem aquest extra d'energia que estava acumulat de fotosíntesi antiga, que els humans hem après a fer funcionar, però que ara, veient com estem, ens està generant un munt de reptes. I també posava aquest tipus de relacions. Ara veig que ell té aquest llibre, el darrer llibre que va publicar en Margalef, que era també en relació a un premi, i ell, aquesta relació que hi ha entre la intensitat de les pertorbacions i la seva freqüència. I aquesta relació, la vida ha anat creixent en aquest context de sistemes més o menys pertorbats en diferents freqüències, però bàsicament la vida pot assimilar una certa intensitat i una certa freqüència, però a mesura que aquesta intensitat es fa més gran, una manera d'escapar-se és anticipar-se i escapar-se, i l'altra és que ja no tens manera de funcionar. Esperem que aquest canvi climàtic no representi una pertorbació tan gran que no ens puguem escapar. Ell també va parlar molt del tema del paper d'aquesta energia, per exemple, en sistemes aquàtics, quan es dona l'efecte de la gravetat, la segregació dels nutrients de les parts altes on arriba la llum i es va dipositant per gravetat en fondària, i com aquesta energia exosomàtica generant barreja permet que els organismes fotosintètics tornin a tenir aquests nutrients necessaris per fer la producció primària, especialment el nitrogen, però també ell parlava molt dels fòsfors. I també va comparar moltes vegades les diferències entre els sistemes terrestres i els sistemes aquàtics. A l'esquerra seria una mica la idea que acabo de comentar. En els sistemes marins, a més, s'afegeix una fondària molt més gran, però en tot cas, si mirem els sistemes terrestres, que avui en parlarem, o en parlareu, parlarà en Yadvinder, doncs fixeu-vos que el que ha fet la vida és també internalitzar molt d'aquests processos, però sempre depenent de l'energia exosomàtica, perquè que els arbres puguin transpirar depèn d'aquesta energia. O sigui, per pujar l'aigua de les arrels i que surti transpirada per les fulles es necessita aquesta energia exosomàtica, i això és un dels exemples de com la vida ha fet servir i ha internalitzat aquests processos. Però si saltem d'escala i anem als sistemes oceànics, doncs també ell va treballar molt amb Margalef en els sistemes d'afloraments i també amb la Marta Estrada i altra gent, doncs una mica aquest paper de jugar d'aquesta importància de l'energia per entendre com s'organitzen els ecosistemes i com funcionen. I ell no va perdre mai de vista el paper dels humans, això és també adaptat d'un treball seu, però bàsicament ell també parlava que aquesta energia exosomàtica no ha parat de créixer. Potser ara hauríem d'afegir la intel·ligència artificial, que moltes vegades la fem servir per qualsevol cosa, però que darrere hi ha una petjada energètica i d'aigua important, però en tot cas feia aquest tipus de comparacions, i ell també molt sensible a la situació del planeta. Aquí tenim un esquema de com els humans primitius, però anem pujant cada vegada més ús d'energia quan anem cap a societats més desenvolupades, però també si ens hi fixem, avui també tindríem una mica això, no? És a dir, malgrat aquí sembli que hi hagi un eix històric, en realitat també està passant avui en dia que tenim sistemes que estan més limitats per l'ús de l'energia i sistemes que potser en fan massa ús, també des del punt de vista dels impactes que genera. I també la importància que té amb aquesta organització de l'espai que hem imposat, que hem desenvolupat els sistemes humans de la societat. Jo també volia dir per als joves avui presents que, com deia abans, el Ramon Margalef no és només l'edifici, és més que això, és tot un munt de coneixement que ens va deixar, i d'aquí ve que poséssim el nom a l'edifici, a la nostra facultat. També vull comentar que com a director del departament, però també soc del Consell de Direcció del Premi, però també vull afegir altres institucions que també participen en el Consell, també el CREAF, també participen el CSIC, diferents institucions de recerca, doncs també vull agrair aquesta col·laboració que fa que aquest acte del Ramon Margalef ens uneixi una mica a tots en poder tenir l'oportunitat de tenir gent tan reconeguda com el cas d'avui. Vull també agrair a la biblioteca. La biblioteca, també ajudat pel Narcís, sempre agafa una exposició dels treballs, en aquest cas en Yadvinder, i compara una mica amb el que havia fet en Ramon Margalef. També dir que aquest premi està suportat per la presidència de la Generalitat de Catalunya, ja fa anys que es va instaurar, com abans deia la Rosina, i a més s'ha consolidat. Si entreu a la web de la Generalitat, poseu Premi Ramon Margalef, veureu allà un llistat de noms d'ecòlegs d'un renom impressionant, i això vol dir que té un impacte gran en aquest món de l'ecologia, però no només, perquè molta de la gent que estan guardonats estan fent molta activitat de recerca que després es transfereix a la societat, com veurem el cas d'en Yadvinder. I jo ho volia deixar aquí. Doncs moltes gràcies, esperem que us agradi la presentació, segur que sí, i podem continuar, si et sembla.
Gràcies, Santi. So, the floor is yours. Yes, if you would.
Do you want to talk here with the microphone here, or you prefer?
That's fine.
That's fine. Okay, good. So maybe this is working. Yeah. Well,
okay, great. Thank you. Okay. Well, good morning. Muchas gracias. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a real honor to come and speak here before the prize ceremony tomorrow as well. And yesterday, I had a wonderful visit to Prades and to see the forests and the research going on there, and to see how seminal Prades has been in developing ecological, ecophysiological ideas worldwide as well. So it's really nice to see this and appreciate this iconic research, both from Prades and from other areas that the ecological community in Barcelona has contributed to global ecology. And of course, there's no bigger contribution to global ecology than the influence of Ramon Margalef. And I confess I knew Ramon Margalef's name as a father figure of ecology, but I hadn't really read any of his books. And I think his impact in the English-speaking world is not what it deserves to be compared to his in Spain or in Latin America overall. But in the last few months, I have been beginning to dive into some of his books and reading them. And what has come through is, I knew him as an ecologist, but really he was a philosopher of life. And the insights he was writing about in the 1970s, 1980s are so relevant today. And in fact, some of the figures, like the ones that Santi just showed there, are things that I've been talking about, as you'll see now. And I'm not realizing that Margalef had been saying these things 20 years, 30 years ago. So there's a rediscovery of his insights that I think, for me, has been personally very important. And in Oxford, I'm director of our Centre for Nature Recovery, which is a centre that looks at what does it take to restore the natural world at scale. We have now many policy declarations from the United Nations, from national governments, from local governments saying we want to restore nature, halt the decline of biodiversity. And so what our centre does is have a multidisciplinary focus on understanding what is required, both from ecology, from social science, from governance, from finance, from the economic system, to do this across different departments. So this is a question that's at core to me. But today, I'm going to mainly talk about one aspect of that, which is more ecological, about how do we think about the ecology of the living world, and maybe challenge some of our traditional assumptions in conservation around that, and to see how that can help us adapt to the tide of change, the huge tide that is overwhelming the planetary ecosystems, planetary societies in different forms, and to think about the way forward. And so in particular, I'm going to talk about this through the lens of energy flow, which is very suitable because Margalef was a pioneer in thinking about ecosystems as energetic systems. So this is from his seminal book in 1968, where he talks about this, that ecology, he describes, is the study of the organization of the biosphere, the patterns that emerge as energy flows and matter cycles. And that's the perspective, this Margalef perspective, that I want to bring to the lecture today. And so we know that pretty much all of life on Earth, perhaps maybe apart from the deep sea vents, are powered by the capture of sunshine by plants or by autotrophs, or phytoplankton in the ocean or marine systems, and by plants on land. And this is the common currency of life. It cascades through plants, then into animals and fungi and other components of the ecosystem. And the structure of that flow of energy and the accompanying flow of matter and information is what makes an ecosystem. And this applies at the level of ecosystems, such as this Amazonian rainforest, both in terms of the biological energy, which is what I'm going to focus on today, and then what Santi was describing as the exosomatic energy, the flow of water through these forests and the generation of clouds and rainfall and how they cycle through. But I'll focus on the biological energy. And it applies at the scale of the planet. And Margalef described the biosphere as this self-organized system, far from equilibrium, maintained by the flow of energy from the sun. So the non-equilibrium nature of the biosphere, the constant building of complexity from some solar power is a defining property of life and a defining property of the planet itself. So getting to the more pragmatic level of thinking about how we measure the state of the biosphere and of biodiversity, and so if we are declining or restoring nature, how would we know? What would we measure to do that? And there are two, broadly saying that you could say there are two spectrum of approaches. One is our approaches that focus very much on species composition, and it could be species richness, or the one that I show here on the top left is the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which is used by the Natural History Museum in London, which models the abundance of key species, the population density, and says how much has that abundance gone down from a baseline level. And so it gives you a measure of the intactness. I'll go back to it later to explore. The other ones are very much more functional approaches, like productivity, carbon storage, water cycling, that measure particular functions that ecosystems provide. Almost always plants. It's very hard to include animals in this framework at a planetary level. So, and so measures things like carbon fluxes, carbon storage. And the challenge we face is there's a conceptual gap between these two, that we have measures of biodiversity and we have measures of planetary ecological function. And yet we don't have an easy way of relating biodiversity to planetary ecological function. We can do it for functions like carbon storage, productivity, but we can't say the number and abundance of species is affecting, particularly non-plant species, is affecting how it's affecting the functioning of the planet. And this has been, and it's important for many reasons that partially it's to recognize how biodiversity is more important than just being biodiversity. It's nice to have birds, it's nice to have insects, but actually more than that, it's essential to have birds and insects because they're so much part of the webs of life that maintain ecosystems and maintain the biosphere. But we don't have at the planetary scale, we have struggled to link that. And that's a danger politically as well, because then we have governments and politicians saying, well, we can't afford to protect our bats or our, because we've got to have development, we've got to have economic growth. And so not recognizing the links between biodiversity and the prosperity of society is a dangerous thing politically as well. And so Margalef, again, has a quote from him that recognizes this, that diversity is not a luxury of nature, but the natural result of the way energy is used and organized. And this is being recognized as a challenge. Many of you will be familiar of the planetary boundaries idea, that there's a framework where human activity is increasing its impact on the planet, and there is a danger that as human activity increases, that we may breach some of these so-called planetary boundaries. The most well-known one is climate change, that if the atmosphere heats beyond a certain level, the planet becomes unstable or rapidly changed. But another important one is what's called biosphere integrity. And for a long time, the scientists, Johan Rockström and others who've been working on this, have recognized biosphere integrity as an important planetary boundary, but they've struggled to come up with a metric for it. The first version of planetary boundaries used rates of species extinction, which was they recognized that was not a good metric, because it's very hard to measure as well when you think about all the insects and the cryptic species. But also, it's not really a boundary, what we know about rates of extinction and the functioning of the planet. And then, about 2015, Will Steffen and others came up with the idea of biodiversity intactness, what I showed you, the abundance of species being a measure of a boundary of the biosphere. And that was tried for a while, and we have these global maps that I've shown you of biodiversity intactness. But recently, at least some of the planetary boundaries community have also walked away from biodiversity intactness. And the reason that they gave here is, I've highlighted in yellow there, the link of biodiversity intactness to Earth system functions remains poorly understood, and biodiversity intactness cannot be directly related to the planetary biogeochemical and energy flows relevant for establishing Earth system state. So they highlight the problem there, but I think in that sentence, you can probably see where I'm going. There's part of the solution, which is a Margalevian solution of thinking about energy flow as a way of perhaps coming over this barrier. And so let's apply this lens of ecological energetics. So the language of information and energy allow us to describe life in terms that are both physical and biological. So that's a useful thing about energy flow. It's something, unlike many metrics that we use in biology, it's something physically real in the world. There is actually a flow of joules that is occurring in ecosystems, that's something real that's happening in the ecosystem. And the other feature is that it's a common currency of life. It's not the only common currency. Nutrient flows, information flow are also part of what makes life, but it is one. And so you can compare plants to different species of insect, to birds, to fungi in principle, to microbes, with the language of energy flow. And the physicist's definition of energy is the ability to do work. And so the more energy flow there is through a species or an individual, the more they're able to do work, to transform the environment around them, to grow, to metabolize, to consume. And so it can be a measure of how much different species do work, and so therefore interact with the wider biosphere. And so that can be a way of linking the species to the functions of ecosystems or the functions of the biosphere. And before we get on to the wider ecosystem, one way to think about this is in terms of, obviously, photosynthesis on land is the primary source of capture of biological energy that powers ecosystems. And I always like to show these to give a hint. This is a cartogram, which is where this is just showing global gross primary productivity. I'm sure many of you have seen this as a map from Modis or other products. But here, this is one of the advantages of being in the geography department, that I talk to people who think about maps quite a lot. And with my colleague Ben Hennig, a few years ago, we made this cartogram, which is normally used for economic data, but here we used it for biological data. And you see the size of a pixel here is the amount of photosynthesis, the amount of biological energy being captured by that pixel. And here this is in July, and the world looks a bit strange. The deserts have shrunk away to nothing. The Sahara is not there. Southern hemisphere is a bit shrunk, but it's vaguely familiar overall. You can recognize this. But look at January. You can see Europe, especially, well, it's a little bit better here in Catalonia, but in Britain we've shriveled away to biological insignificance in January. And you see that the world is dominated by the magnificent metabolism of the tropics. The tropical rainforests, the savannas, and so we live on a tropical planet in terms of land, productivity, and biological activity. And look at the size of Brazil here, and biologically the largest country on Earth compared to the Northern Hemisphere in January. And so we can do this for every month of the year, and so come up with this cycling of the relative energy flows through the tropics and the extratropics, the great green heartbeat of the terrestrial biosphere. We can try to do something similar with the marine biosphere, but it's much, much more tricky because the patterns of productivity around upwelling and zones are much more difficult to scale into this cartogram type approach. We tried, but it was a mess. And so that's a pattern of the spatial pattern of the biosphere. And then we can also think about how did this energetic biosphere evolve over time. And this is it's estimation. I won't say there's any real data in here, but it's sort of an expert guess about how we can think of the biosphere over the last 1,000 million years. So the Earth is around 4,800 million years, so this is roughly around a fifth of the age back on Earth. And for most of that time, life has been oceanic, and it's been microbial, and slowly developed in complexity over time. Life appears very soon after it becomes possible. The Earth becomes stable enough to support life. We see the first signs of microbial life. Complex life, eukaryotes, emerges around half the age of the Earth, but multicellular life is quite late. And so if you go back over 1,000 million years, you see at the start we have all of productivity, energy flow is in the oceans. And there are times when it dips down to almost zero, like the snowball Earth events, like 700 million years ago, when the Earth almost entirely froze over. And all that was left is perhaps a little bit of slush or slightly open water in the equatorial regions of the tropics, and everything else was ice. And so productivity dropped to almost zero. And then things began to complexify. Around 600 million years ago, in the Ediacaran, you start seeing complex multicellular life start to emerge. Then in the Cambrian, you see fossil structures, more ecosystems of predators and prey, and more complex life emerge. And so you see, as life complexifies, you see the productivity of the oceans rising over time as more structures to capture more energetic resources and use them to lead to more complex information and more complex ecosystems. But the big transition in life as a whole on Earth occurs around 450 million years ago, when life works out how to occupy the land surface. So the land surface represents this huge potential supply of energy, all of this solar radiation falling onto the Earth's surface. But life had a problem. It was evolved in the oceans, it was highly dependent on water, and there wasn't enough way of capturing and storing water on land that this microbial life could use to exploit the land surface. And eventually, life came up with innovations, plant vascular systems, symbiotic relationships with fungi that enabled life to start colonizing land by storing water, by having root systems that could capture water deeper in the soil, so it didn't just wash away into rivers and into the ocean, and slowly complexified. As life became more complex on land, you had the first forests. The water started being recycled back. So rainwater, rather than rushing into the ground or into rivers, started going through transpiration systems back to the atmosphere, humidifying the atmosphere, generating more rainfall, enabling more life to spread. So that feedback loop enabled the gradual expansion of life on land, the expansion of forests and complex structures. And so what happens overall, you see this doubling of energy flow through the biosphere. And so the key innovation there is life got access to a source of energy that was previously unavailable to life, which was all of the energy, solar radiation falling on land suddenly became available. The biosphere complexified and increased in productivity. And that increased over time. Around 150 million years ago, you see another innovation, which is the evolution of the angiosperms, the flowering plants, the broadleaf plants that have much more efficient photosynthetic approaches, ways of capturing energy. And probably the peak in terms of metabolic activity is around 50 million years ago in the Eocene, where we had hothouse Earth conditions, when tropical type climates extended all the way to Scandinavia or Alaska, and temperatures were 5 to 8 degrees warmer than the present, and you had the peak of productivity on Earth. And then you see a gradual decline in terrestrial productivity. Since then, linked to the cooling of the Earth and the drawdown of carbon dioxide that made photosynthesis more challenging as well, and drier conditions on Earth. And that's linked almost certainly to the collision of India into Asia, the rise of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau, and the weathering and the drawdown of carbon dioxide that caused over the last 50 million years, with some other feedback loops that have caused the cooling of the Earth, leading to the ice ages of the last 1 or 2 million years. So we see changes over time, oscillations in Earth's conditions linked to volcanism and weathering and the rise of mountains, but overall a story of complexifying life through all of these transitions. And so there's some of the key transitions there that I described. And so that gives you the big picture. So now I want to go down to the more pragmatic level of how do we measure the flows of energy at the local scale, and then I'll zoom back out to the scale of the biosphere overall. Because I strongly have always believed that ecology has to be rooted as an empirical science in direct measurement and field work, and we can have our models and our remote sensing, and they're all important tools that we should use, but it also needs to be rooted in real measurement and understanding of your local ecosystem or specific ecosystem. So that's it's always wonderful to see field study sites like we saw yesterday. And one of our contributions to this has been coming up with a network mainly focused in the tropics, looking at quantifying the productivity of tropical ecosystems. Initially, we started in forests, and then thanks to the influence of Ima Oliveras and others, we also expanded into savannas with this approach. And so we built this global network, or the Global Ecosystems Monitoring Network, that measures the productivity, the primary productivity of ecosystems around the world. We have a manual around this as well. And one other thing is, we also really wanted to do this as a long-term project. So rather than having short-term projects where you just measure something and go away and write up, we really invested in local collaborators and students and scientists, and building long-term relationships around the tropics. Initially in South America, and then in the last 10, 15 years also more in Africa, a little bit in Southeast Asia as well, and in some areas outside of the tropics, like in Chile. And just to describe the energy, we could talk about it as a carbon, but I think there's also carbon and energy can be treated as equivalent in many ways. So if you think of any ecosystem, not just a forest, the major components of energy flow are the capture of energy by the autotrophs, so by the plants, or the trees in a forest. Much of that energy is used by the plants themselves for their own metabolism. Typically around 70% of the captured carbon is then released by the plants through their own metabolism, through leaves, through wood, through the root system. And the rest is used mainly to produce new biomass. And that can be in the canopy, in the form of leaves and flowers and fruits and twigs, It can be in the woody material, the branches, the stem, the below ground coarse roots, or it can be in the fine root system below ground. And some of it also then can be used as material sugars for symbiotic fungi, mycorrhizae, and others, other components. All of that biomass eventually ends up as dead material, whether through litter fall, shedding of leaves and fruit, or fine roots, or eventually when the plant dies. And then that is consumed primarily by microbes, by fungi and bacteria, and released as heterotrophic respiration, the metabolism of the fungi. And a small fraction of this material is directly consumed by herbivores, and a smaller fraction of those herbivores are consumed by carnivores. And so this describes broadly the cycling of energy or carbon in an ecosystem. And so what we've tried to do in GEM is initially just focusing on the plant part of this to try and describe this and build diagrams such as this for different tropical ecosystems and other ecosystems around the world. And then more recently, I'll get on to, we've also started focusing on those two arrows on the left and look at how the vegetation then cascades through into the animal community. And so this is another way of thinking about that cycle. We have gross primary productivity and photosynthesis, then plant respiration and metabolism, then you have net primary productivity, the production of biomass, wood productivity, this fraction of biomass that is wood, and then the standing biomass is dominated by wood, so that depends also on the rate at which trees die as much as the rate that they grow, the residence time, and that. And so when we think about things like measuring ecosystem state from remote sensing or modeling, particularly in terms of carbon fluxes, we tend to focus either at the one end on understanding photosynthesis, and whether through models or optical or remote sensing, or at the other end on understanding biomass through forest censuses or LiDAR approaches. But actually there's this chain of causality between the two of many other factors that link one to the other. So more photosynthesis doesn't always mean more biomass, because these other factors can change. More biomass or doesn't always mean that there has been proved that there's more photosynthesis. There could be other factors at play in a system. And so what we have done is, in terms of actual measurements, is we measure, in these plots, we measure things like the rate of growth with dendrometers. We measure the canopy production through litter fall, measuring leaves and flowers and fruit. We measure the rate of root growth in the soil through ingrowth cores. And we measure the fluxes of carbon dioxide, the metabolism of the soil, with experiments to separate out between root-free soil and soil with litter, without litter, to try and understand the components. And we do the same on the stems of trees for the wood, and some measurements occasionally for the leaves to measure respiration and photosynthesis in the leaves. And link this to climate data to come up with this detailed description. And here's one example. We've now done this for about 50 or 60 sites, mainly in the tropics, and gives you one of the type of diagram that we produce of carbon flow or energy flow in these systems. And I'll just highlight, I won't go through the details of this, but some features to notice. So the woody production, the growth of trees, if you're a forester, you're very interested in the growth of trees, is less than 10%, about 7% of the photosynthesis ends up to produce wood. So most of that energy captured by the trees is being used for other things, their own metabolism, for their canopies, for their fine root system. And so there's a very, to understand how woody growth is linked to global change factors such as carbon dioxide, we need to also understand this cascade of energy, this dance of energy in the ecosystem, and how they flow together. And the same can be true in many sites. And so this is the number of sites that we've tried to produce these diagrams. A lot of our early work was in Latin America. The last 10 years, we particularly focused on Africa, which had no such studies. And now we have over 40 different sites across Africa that are in forests and savannas that are produced or are producing these sorts of diagrams, all the way from the savannas of South Africa and Kenya to the forests of the Congo and Gabon. And so just to give an example of some of the study sites we have, in Ghana, we have a precipitation gradient going from wet rainforest to dry savanna, looking at the functions of the forest and the ecosystem along that gradient. In Gabon, we look at the effects of... Gabon is one of the few places in the world where you've got intact megafauna in a forest. So you've got elephants and gorillas, and it's like going into a Tarzan movie when you go on fieldwork there. And so we look at the effects of megafauna on the large animals and shaping ecological functions in the forest. In Peru, we did a lot of work since 2003 using an elevation gradient going from the lowland rainforest to the high Andes at 3,500 meters and looking at how temperature controls the functioning of ecosystems that cycling. And this was the work that Ima first started off joining us in Oxford for, and has worked since as well. In Brazil, we look at the impacts of logging and fire in the Amazon and how those are affecting these functions. In Malaysia, we look at the impacts of logging. I'll show you some results in a moment from that. And we also have an elevation gradient in Australia. So, so the nice thing of this is we're not just looking at natural systems, we're using experimental systems as well to understand how ecosystems are responding to global change. So that's about plants. So what I've described there is something that I've talked about many times in the last 10 years around how the carbon cycling, the productivity of plants is affected by climate and disturbance and how that's changing over time. But the last 5 or so years, I've got interested in looking beyond the plants. And when we think of an ecosystem, it certainly depends on the department that you're raised in, but plant ecologists tend to stop at the plants. We tend to look at the plants and describe that and say that's the ecosystem. But we know that the zoologists are very interested in the insects and the animals there. But very rarely do we integrate the plant ecology with the animal ecology at a systemic level in an ecosystem. And so we got curious about thinking ecosystems are so much more than plants and terrestrial ecosystems. And they are all the animals and the microbes and all those interactions. Can we come up with a way of integrating across all of those? And so it comes down again, one approach. There are other approaches as well, but one approach is certainly to think about energy flow as a way of doing that integration. And so the key question then is, how do we calculate energy use by animals? If we're particularly focusing on animals as a starting point. And one possibility would be to go out and watch the animal and see what it's consuming and then calculate that. And for small things like insects, or that is actually a viable approach to estimate these consumption rates. But for most animals, that's not practical. So what we instead do is use allometric equations. And so broadly speaking, for any one type of animal, like a mammal or a bird or a reptile, there's a relationship, which can be different for these groups, between the mass of an animal and the amount of energy required to maintain that animal. And on logarithmic scales, it approximates a straight line. There's a lot of variation depending on the behavioral characteristics of any particular species. Broadly, and one of the things on a logarithmic scale, the slope is approximately 3/4. This is Kleiber's law, and one of the few things in ecology that claims to be a law. You could debate about it. And there's a whole field of ecology, the metabolic theory of ecology, that looks at whether there's fundamental rules in the nature of 3D organisms and circulation systems or vascular systems that can explain this 3/4. Why it's 3/4? 3/4 matters because it means that a larger animal per unit mass has a lower metabolism than a smaller animal. So an elephant has a bigger metabolism than a human, but a kilogram of elephant has a slower metabolism than a kilogram of human. And we have a slower metabolism than a kilogram of mouse. So why does life slow down as it gets bigger? This is what the metabolic theory of ecology tries to understand. Is it efficiencies, or what are the scales there? And the theory is controversial in some areas, but we don't need to agree or disagree with the theory. We can just use the empirical observation of this relationship between body mass and energy flow to calculate the energy consumption. So we can do this, for example, if we in the UK, we can look at our top predator, the Eurasian badger, 10 kilograms in mass. And then from its mass, we can calculate the amount of energy required to maintain a badger, which is around 5,000 kilojoules of energy per day, using these equations. And then this is based on a site near Oxford, Whiteton Woods, where we do a lot of work. The badgers there have been studied since the 1950s, so the badger ecologists have a very good idea of what the badgers are eating. So we have a good estimate that mainly they're eating invertebrates, and then in the autumn they also eat fruit. And then for each of those, there's a different assimilation efficiency, how efficiently animals can absorb the food that they eat. So we can look those up in a table, and then we can calculate the amount of food energy of each type going in to support a badger. And this was so this calculation was prompted by a conversation in a pub with a zoologist in Oxford. And the question was, how much energy does it take to sustain a badger? How many photons does it take to sustain a badger? And the answer was 1.5 kilomoles per day. So there's a physics joke in there, a chemistry joke. So anyway, then we can scale from individuals to the population of badgers in a woodland. So in this site in Oxford, we know that there are roughly 20 badgers in our study plot, 18 hectares. And we can do, so we have a population density of 1.1 badgers per hectare. And then we need to know a little bit about how active they are. How much food are they sourcing from outside of the forest? Are they active all year? No, they hibernate for a couple of months in the year. If they're birds, they'll be migrating in and out, other factors. So we have those additional factors, but the key variable is population density. We need to know the population density. And then we can say the food energy consumption by the badger population is 120 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And we can do that for every animal. If we have the information or an estimate of the population density of an animal and say what's the total energy consumption of that animal, of that species, then we can sum over the species in an ecosystem and come up with the total for that. And I'll give you now one example of application of this approach to a GEM site where we've already been doing the plant productivity, and now we can couple in the animal productivity. And this site is the tropical rainforests of Borneo in Southeast Asia, amongst the most magnificent rainforests on Earth, typical height 45, 50 meters canopy, super high diversity, absolutely stunning forests. This is the Maliau in Sabah in Malaysia. And then I want to compare energy flow with a logged forest. And many of these forests of Malaysia and Indonesia have been heavily logged, so repeatedly, a huge loss of biomass and structure and carbon stores. But we wanted to understand in this project how that was affecting the ecology of these forests beyond the carbon stores. And one way to do that, this was a project led by Imperial College, but we are particularly focused on some of the biogeochemical processes. And one way to do this was through energy flow. And so one of the questions we wanted to challenge is that when you look at these heavily logged forests, they're often labeled degraded forests. Heavily used by people, heavily logged. And degraded is a term I want to challenge. We use it quite a lot in ecosystems. And if you label an ecosystem degraded, on one hand, maybe it's an incentive to conserve or restore that ecosystem, and it helps in that process. But often, it's saying an ecosystem is of lesser value, that it's ruined. So if you're going to convert an area of land into agriculture or an oil palm plantation, we're not going to protect the old growth forest, but the degraded lands, we can put our biofuel crop or our infrastructure or our agriculture into degraded lands. There's a danger that we assign a lower ecological value to things that have been modified by people. And maybe that's true in some cases, but we need the ecological evidence to say what's happening there, rather than just say, oh, well, people have used this, so therefore it's of lower value. And in many places around the world, we're seeing decisions being made by governments where they say, we're protecting nature, but we're only going to use degraded lands, degraded ecosystems for our economic development. And there's a danger there that we wanted to explore. And so if you look in terms of carbon storage or biomass, these are undoubtedly structurally degraded ecosystems. So the left, these are LiDAR images with lasers from aircraft measuring the height. And you can see on the left these magnificent old growth forests, 60-meter tall canopy, astonishing structures. And on the right, you see these heavily logged forests where you've lost that structure. You've lost all the large trees. The height is much, much lower. So in terms of carbon storage or biomass, these are undoubtedly degraded forests. But are they ecologically degraded? So we did our normal net primary productivity measurements that I described before, and we see the productivity is maintained from the old growth to the logged forest, possibly increases slightly, and even in the oil palm plantation, but mainly in the oil palm plantation, it's in the form of fruit, oil palm fruit. So productivity doesn't change much, maybe it increases slightly, but what about the energy flow into the rest of the ecosystem? And in this study, we had really good data collected by colleagues in Kent on birds and mammals. We had estimates of the population density of every bird species and every mammal species in these landscapes. So we could use this energy flow approach to calculate the amount of energy. So how much of this captured energy is going through the birds and the mammals? And so when I started this work, I think my expectation was to show that energy flow was maintained in the logged forest, that actually it wasn't collapsing, and then it was collapsing in the oil palm plantation, the conversion to agriculture. What we found was quite a surprise. We actually found that the energy flow was greater through the logged forest, 2.5 times greater. So the birds were consuming 2.5 times as much food, and also the same was in the mammals. So around 2.5 times greater, and then energy flow collapsed. So I'm using the same calculation I showed for the badger, but we're doing it for every bird species, for every mammal species in the forest. And also in this forest, we found birds, there was twice as much energy flow through birds than through mammals. And sometimes because birds have smaller biomass, we tend to, when you do a biomass assessment, the mammals tend to dominate. But because birds have much higher active metabolisms, and they're smaller, which also means per mass they have a higher metabolism, they tend to have a much more influence on the energetics of a forest or any ecosystem than just looking at biomass would tell you. And okay, we see more energy flow, but this could just be a few generalist disturbance-adapted species taking over in the logged forest. This is not more energy flow in itself isn't necessarily a measure of ecological health or functionality. Firstly, we wanted to look at diversity. So one thing we did is then calculate the number of species and the spread of energy across different species in different functional groups. So the size of the circle here is the amount of energy flow in those groups, those gills. Arboreal insectivorous birds, for example, at the top you can see this is in the old growth forest, and the circle is much bigger in the logged forest, then collapses in the oil palm, or terrestrial herbivores from being here small to here. But the key things to notice are firstly, S is the number of species in that group, and those S numbers are not going down. So we're not seeing a big loss in diversity. And E is what I call the energetic Shannon-Wiener index, which is the spread of energy across species. And we also see that is largely not going down. So the energy is not getting channeled into one or two dominant disturbance-adapted species. And so this is where an idea since this paper that we've been developing is this idea of ecological vibrancy as a measure of the function of an ecosystem, which is both the magnitude of energy flowing through different trophic groups multiplied by the spread of energy, how it's spread across different species. And we've developed those ideas a little bit since that paper, and I won't go into details here, but essentially by looking at the network the food web of an ecosystem, and by using this Shannon-Wiener information theory approach to look at the spread of information across in terms of energy flow across the system, gives us a measure the vibrancy of an ecosystem. And since reading Margalef, I realized this is a very Margalef idea, this coupling of energy and information, and how energy creates information spread as well. So Ramon was there many decades ago and thinking through these when we were revitalizing some of these approaches. So what we're trying to do, and I don't think we've found the full answer, there's many different ways of thinking of what trophic levels to include, what species to include, but can ecological vibrancy move beyond being a metaphor about an ecosystem to a formally defined ecological metric that focuses on the vitality of ecosystems? And if we can think, even if we can't measure it everywhere, if we think of vibrancy, it's perhaps a way of understanding the recovery of ecosystems that is less normative. Part of the danger is, I think, when we think about recovery, we don't look at ecological function enough, and we bring in other values like, is this what it was like 100 years ago? Or are these native species or non-native species that are providing these ecological functions? So, and some of those values are important, and I don't say we should ignore those values, but I think it's good to look at the ecology for its own sake and see what the ecology is doing, and then decide whether other values like nativeness and other things are also important things to include. And I think energy flow is a way of trying to understand ecology separated from our values about what should or should not an ecosystem should or should not be doing. One thing I should also mention, I didn't have a slide here, is that you could have non-native or disturbance-adapted species moving in to explain this pattern, but actually what we find is that it's this forest species in the forest that are increasing in population density and benefiting rather than it just being non-native species coming in. So why do these logged forests have this amplified energy flow? And the key here is plant traits. So in a rainforest, the plants, the trees have won the game of life. They've got to the canopy, they're reproducing, and they're capturing loads of solar energy. And what they focus on is chemical defense. They don't want their leaves to be eaten by herbivores, in particular by invertebrates. And so the leaves of a rainforest are full of toxins targeted. And there's an evolutionary games race where invertebrate herbivores are trying to consume those plants, and the plants are developing chemical mechanisms to defend against the new types of consumer. And so a forest canopy, particularly an old-growth forest canopy, is a site of intense chemical warfare between the plants and their predators. And that chemical warfare mediates how much energy is going from the plants to higher trophic levels. The more chemically defended a plant is, or the less energy is available to the animals and the higher community. And what happens when you disturb an ecosystem, whether it's a forest or a savanna or something else, is that you shift the trade-off in the plants. So rather than investing so heavily in defense, they prioritize rapid growth to capture new light resources, to outcompete their neighbors, and therefore they reduce their chemical defense. And that makes the vegetation more palatable, and therefore that boosts the amount of energy going into the herbivores, whether the insects or the mammals, and then that cascades through to the insectivores, and then through the whole ecosystem. So what this energetic approach showed you is how plant traits mediate the amount of energy going from the plants, the autotrophs, to the wider ecosystem. And you can describe this through this energy approach. There are some other factors as well. More vegetation near the ground, so the large animal, because the light coming to the ground, so the deer and the elephants can consume more energy. There's more concentration of resources, more fruiting. The plants also respond to disturbance by fruiting. So there are other factors, but mainly it's the leaf traits that are determining this energy flow. So we can look at this site and see this as a site of intense chemical competition, toxic compounds against herbivory, and then that's disturbed when the system is disturbed. So one important caveat, and I was very, very careful in the paper to make this very clearly, I'm not saying that we should go and log tropical rainforests or other old-growth systems to improve their energy flow. There's immense ecological value in these pristine systems, well-protected systems, beyond energy flow, rare specialist species, biomass, long histories of evolution. But really the call is to recognize the ecological value of human-modified and disturbed systems. They can be rich in ecological function. Sometimes some of those functions are even higher than they are in the old growth system. So pristineness, the absence of people, isn't necessarily the highest state of nature. People do modify nature in many ways that can amplify ecological functions. As Ramon Margalef said, disturbances are not only destructive, there are opportunities for ecosystems to reorganize and to diversify. And so, we can think about many traditional human-modified systems, slash and burn, shifting agricultural systems, where smallholders clear an area, burn an area, and then secondary growth comes up in a mosaic landscape of different ages, and that can often amplify ecological functions in that landscape. And smallholder farmers, this is a small farm in Nigeria, where again, moderate interference with an ecosystem has often amplified many ecological functions. And sometimes, as conservationists, we often focus very much on what is lost. Maybe a particular large animal species or something else is lost, but we don't look at an integrated view of how the ecosystem is functioning as a whole. So all we see is the story of the loss, rather than the story of the whole functioning, and whether, in many cases that might be lost, but at other times it isn't lost. And I think an integrated ecosystem view can be very helpful in those contexts. We also know what is not a vibrant ecosystem. And here's an example in the monocultures of a single species. In Britain, it would be Sitka spruce. Here, maybe eucalyptus or pine that are planted, maybe for timber, maybe for carbon sequestration, maybe for climate change goals. But all that rich diversity of natural ecosystems is reduced and channelized into a single species, and the vibrancy of this ecosystem is destroyed. So I would argue that ecologically, this is not a forest. This is a tree crop. And so there's a danger if we don't respect the vibrancy, the interconnection of food webs and the complexity of ecosystems, that we make the biosphere more industrialized, more reduced. Even in our attempt to solve problems like climate change, there's a danger of using nature as some sort of industrial carbon tool that we turn up and down to try and deal with climate change, rather than respecting the inherent energies of the biosphere of ecosystems themselves. So moving on, just coming back now to a question that I asked at the start: how do we connect biodiversity metrics to planetary function? And so I've introduced you to energy flow as a way that we can look at the local level and have perhaps it gives us a new perspective on how energy flows in ecosystems. But what about at this planet? Let's return to this planetary level of how do we link biodiversity level to understand the ecological power of ecosystems at a planetary level. And this is a this is a paper where we focused on sub-Saharan Africa, and we used a biodiversity intactness index for Africa that's not based on the model that I showed earlier, but is an expert-derived approach where the authors interviewed several hundred ecological experts on different taxa and different biomes, and they said this is how they expect this taxon to decrease in abundance in different biomes. And then they had a tool for an approach to integrate all of that to produce this more higher resolution map of the biodiversity intactness of Africa. And here you see areas such as the Congo Basin, especially the national parks in dark green, but other areas in relatively high intactness. And you see areas such as Nigeria or parts of the lakes region of East Africa with much lower biodiversity intactness. So the question I want to look at here is, can we turn this biological biodiversity data into ecological function data? Can we describe how this loss of intactness in Africa translates into the ecological power of African species, the ecological function of African ecosystems? And what we did is a similar approach to what I described at the individual sites before, but we had to do some modeling. So we took if each pixel in sub-Saharan Africa, we used these allometric equations that I showed, and we then had to model population densities using work by Luca Santini and his group to try using range data and environmental data to model population densities. And then we could look at the potential flow in intact landscapes. So the intact landscape is here, if everywhere was near 100% intactness, which is the intactness we find in national parks. And there's a debate in Africa with a long history of the human alteration, even is that really a good baseline or not? And then we can look at the energy flow in the intact landscape, and then we can then look at the current landscape with the different land uses, the agriculture, and look at the energy flow in the current landscape. And by coincidence, this paper is coming out in Nature at 5 o'clock today. so just purely by chance. So you can look it up this evening. And this is work that Ima also was very closely involved in. Overall, it's led by our PhD student, Ty Loft. And so the top figure shows the energy flow in the intact landscapes of Africa in birds and mammals. We only use birds and mammals. That's the data that's rich. We recognize that invertebrates are hugely important. It's just that the data sets are terrible, and it's really hard to produce this yet. And that's an area that we need to progress on for sure. But looking at birds and mammals, and then the bottom shows you the current landscapes of Africa and the energy flow through them. So you see a decline. It's interesting looking at that intact landscape, and you see Eastern and Southern Africa dominating that pattern. And we're not sure whether that shows something really geological, biogeographic, where you've got the Rift Valley and the volcanism of East Africa leading to more fertile soils and higher animal populations, or whether that's a little bit of a bias in the data that West Africa has been so impacted for so long that even our baseline data are perhaps not that reliable. And so maybe 5,000 years ago, West Africa also had much higher energy flows than our current national parks in West Africa can capture. But you can see the interesting patterns there that we need to explore, and you can see this decline in energy flow now. And we can sum up overall species, and we can say that the food consumption by wild African birds and mammals has decreased to 64% of baseline value. So you could argue the ecological power of African wildlife is at about 2/3 of its baseline value. And this is a way of integrating across many species. Many of you will be familiar with something called the Living Planet Index, that you see these headlines that say that 80% of mammals have disappeared since 1970. Those headlines are not accurate, and it's about particular populations that are followed, often at the frontiers of deforestation. And why they may be, even the authors recognize that they shouldn't be interpreted that way. But I think those sort of headlines can lead to over-pessimism. We haven't lost 80% of mammals since 1970. This is Africa, but I think more globally, we've lost about 30 to 40% of our ecological power since the pre-industrial baseline. That's a more accurate ecological assessment rather than these stories that can be misinterpreted. And so we can look at particular ecosystems. If we look at forests in Africa, the outer circle is the baseline, and the inner circle is the current energy flow through forests. So you see in forests, the biggest collapse has been on the bottom left in the large terrestrial herbivores. So the elephants, the gorillas, so there you see a big contraction in ecological power. But other things, the smaller animals in particular are more resilient than the larger animals. So you see those ecological functions are more maintained. If you compare to our site in Borneo, you see some interesting biogeographic differences. In Borneo, insectivores and birds dominated. There's very few mammals. In Africa, you see the arboreal frugivore, the primates in particular, dominating an energy flow. And that's biogeography. Borneo's forests are full of dipterocarp trees that are wind dispersed, that don't produce fruit. So they're hungry forests. There are not many fruits for mammals to eat. Whereas Africa's forests are full of large fruit dispersed by monkeys and by elephants, and therefore you have support a much higher mammal consumption in those forests. So you see biogeography coming through in explaining these energy flows. If you look at savanna systems, grassy systems, you see similarly a large collapse in despite all the famous wildlife of the Serengeti and those iconic areas, there has been a large collapse in in the large animals, the terrestrial herbivores in Africa, but the smaller components are strong still, and the arboreal system is much smaller than forests because there's less trees for, as habitat. And if you look at arid systems, which are really understudied, this is a little bit, I think we need some more data to be sure of this. But what we find is the below ground vertebrates, the mole rats, the fossorial system dominates in energy flow. And they're really not studied at the systematic energetics level. They're so hard to study because they're underground and buried. But the suggestions are that there's a much stronger below ground ecosystem hidden under the deserts and the dry arid systems that could have more attention. So that's still about energy flow. So how do we relate energy flow to ecological function? And one way is by lumping animals into functional groups. So here what we've done is look at the animals, the birds and mammals that are grazers or browsers, or soil formers, or insectivores, or nutrient dispersers, seed dispersers, and you look at the total amount of energy going into the animals in that functional group. And then you can say how much the energy flow into that function has decreased over time. It's not perfect because different animals have different efficiencies at which they can perform that function for the same level of energy. Aardvark has big claws, it can turn soil over much more efficiently than other animals. But it's one way of looking at the decline in particular functions. And what you see is some functions like nutrient dispersal that depend on large animals or grazing and browsing have declined a lot, and other functions that depend on smaller animals or on birds have declined less. So what we are doing here is now mapping biodiversity information on intactness into ecological functions at the scale of the whole continent, and potentially we could do this at the scale of the planet. So the energy flow is a useful functional way of looking at ecosystems, but it can be hard work to, empirically. Maybe you can model things, but actually measuring this is a lot of work. So a logical question is to say, well, how good are existing indicators? Do we need to do energetics everywhere to be able to understand processes? And so here we're plotting energy intactness against biodiversity intactness, the abundance of species for birds and mammals across all functions. And there we see that birds for birds, there's a reasonably good relationship, whereas for mammals, the relationship breaks down. And you can do the same for species richness as well. And why it works for birds, more or less, across multiple functions is because there's more redundancy. There's more bird species performing similar functions, and there's a smaller range in body sizes between the smallest birds and the largest birds. Whereas in mammals, there's the unique functions performed by particular animals, and nothing else can do what an elephant can do, or as one example. And so therefore, what mammal you are matters much, much more. With a bird, there's probably a bird quite similar to you performing quite similar functions. But for many mammals, your functions are quite unique. And therefore, species richness is not a good proxy for the mammal ecological functions in a landscape. You have to drill down into what individual mammals are doing. And then we can also look at which species contribute most to the energetics. And just a headline, what we find in the baseline conditions is that the elephant was once consumed 8% accounted for 8% of the vertebrate energy flow in Africa. So the two species, the savanna elephant and the forest elephant. And the second up was 6 species, but the mole rats, these below ground systems, were also 4% of energy flow in Africa. And firstly, it shows you the ecological power of elephants, how significant they were. And I think this has a broader significance. One of my other interests is around the megafaunal extinctions in Europe and North America and other parts that happened 10 to 20,000 years ago. And until 20,000 years ago, almost all the world, apart from Australia and Antarctica, were dominated by elephants. And the Americas, Asia, Europe, we had multiple species of elephant in these landscapes. And they've disappeared 20,000 years ago, often linked to first human arrival. So you could think about a time when actually the dominant vertebrate on Earth was the elephant. And you could talk about the Proboscidocene, the era of the elephants, that gradually has been replaced by the Anthropocene, where humans became the dominant vertebrates on Earth. And that changes your thinking about how ecosystems are adapted, and maybe many of the structures we see in ecosystems are responses to a world where these plants evolved, which were dominated by large elephants roaming through the landscapes, whether here in Catalonia or in North America or anywhere else. So the final part I'm going to do is go to the planetary level again. And then when we talk about the energetics I showed you at the start, we often think about an image of the planet such as this, the living biosphere. And yet we know our planet, this is a good proxy for how our planet is at the moment, that it has that living biosphere from which we have emerged as a species, but it's also a planet with increasing levels of human presence and activity that is modifying that biosphere. And these lights at night are a good way of capturing those transitions. And if you look at these images of lights over time, you see some fascinating and important things. You see areas such as sub-Saharan Africa lighting up as villages get electricity for the first time. That brings health and education and multiple benefits. So there's lots of human benefits. It's told the story of these lights. And in India as well, you see huge transitions in the last 10 years. But at the same time, we know all of this activity is occurring in the thin shell of the biosphere and the atmosphere and the oceans. And so how these activities can be reconciled with the fragility of our biosphere is an important question, and one that Margalef was thinking about for a long time. And so the one way to think about this in terms of energy flow is, as well as biological metabolism, we can talk about extended metabolism or social metabolism, how humans use much more energy than just their biological energy to support them. And Santi, your figures earlier on were exactly the type of thinker and I wasn't aware of that work. It's amazing how much this work has occurred in the 70s and 80s. So energy flow through metabolism describes our ability to change the world around us, and our human metabolism is embedded within the planetary metabolism. We're not separate from the world, we're part of the world. We've emerged from the world, and we're modifying that world. And so can we compare the energy flow through humanity with the metabolism of the rest of the biosphere? So this is very much a little in the spirit of the figure that you showed earlier. So if we could go back 10,000 years to everybody on Earth was a hunter-gatherer, which is a blink of an eye in ecological time, absolutely no time at all. And even a hunter-gatherer, well, for the biological metabolism of the hunter-gatherer is similar to ours, so around 120 watts, as each of us are burning the energy of 2 old-fashioned light bulbs as we sit in this room in our metabolism. But even a hunter-gatherer has an extended metabolism in the hunting for food, burning fire, various things that they're doing to sustain themselves. And so the extended metabolism is around 300 watts. But one key feature of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is that it could only support a low population density, with a few exceptions. If you have a rich fishery, a salmon fishery or something, generally you can't support high human populations with a gathering landscape, because you're dependent on what you can get from natural ecosystems, a bit of fruit, a bit of wild meat. But actually, most ecosystems aren't that generous in the food that they give, the plants give to the wider, the energy flow they give to wider populations. And so the metabolism per unit area of a hunter-gatherer society is typically around 30 watts per square meter. So multiplying this extended metabolism by this population density, which is the energy of a slight light bulb per square kilometer. And if you compare that to the energy flow through a tropical savanna, which is around 30 megawatts per square kilometer of biological energy flow, it's tiny. It's a tiny fraction of a percent. And this reflects how much humans could modify these landscapes, their ability to do work. And we were still modifying these landscapes. We were changing fire regimes. Maybe we were hunting some particular species. But overall, the biological power of the ecosystem was so much stronger than human society power. So it was always relatively moderate, the influences that humans could have on these ecosystems. This all began to change around 5,000 years ago with the Neolithic Revolution, the spread of agriculture, and One way of thinking of agriculture is that it is the colonization of ecosystems. So we turn ecosystems into something where their primary function is to provide resources for humanity, whether it's food or wood or other materials. We're repurposing an ecosystem to be primarily for human use. And this mode reached its peak around 1700, and this is an image for Central Europe around 1700. And we can do these same calculations. I'd be interested to compare these numbers with Margalef's ones and see that I'm sure they're very similar. These are ones I did myself based on some literature. So the extended metabolism of humanity is around 2,000 watts per square meter. So you can see this landscape, people are modifying it, we're using animals for agriculture. There's a much wider energy use supporting the society. Population density, one thing about the agricultural mode of life is you can support much higher population densities than hunter-gatherers. And this is probably why agriculture has dominated over history, over hunter-gatherers. Lots of evidence shows that the transition to agriculture caused a decrease in the quality of individual human lives. People became less healthy, they became shorter, the societies became more hierarchical, elite capture by kings and chieftains led to dominance and slavery and many, many other issues. So people's individual lives became lower quality in the transition to agriculture, but you could support much higher population density, so agricultural societies could dominate over non-agricultural societies. And this is a story, though, even now we see happening in the Amazon and other places around the world. And so if you multiply these two numbers together, you get a per unit energy flow of 80 kilowatts per square kilometer, which is about 5% of the natural metabolism of a temperate forest, which would have existed there before. So it's starting to become significant. We shouldn't expect this number to be 100% or something. It just shows you that now humans are able to have substantial ecosystem-altering effects because their energy flow is significant compared to the natural energy flows of the ecosystem. And all of this changed around 1700 with a transition to a new source of energy, which is fossil fuels, initially coal and later oil and gas. And one way of thinking about this transition in energy is that society invented a time machine. And so up until then, all the energy human societies use came from the contemporary biosphere. It came from either food crops from that year's growth, or if you're using timber or wood, from the last few decades of biosphere productivity. But when humans started using fossil fuels, they tapped into the energy of the past biosphere. So energy captured by plants or plankton 200 million years ago, buried, and then being used. So we invented a time machine that enabled us to access the energy of the past to power the present. We gained access to a previously inaccessible source of energy, the energy of the deep past. So what we often call progress is often the conversion of stored order into waste energy. And so if we can map the metabolism this is of Eurasia, all the way from China to Western Europe over the last 12,000 years, and you see per capita, you see this gradual rise of metabolism, peaking about 2,000 years ago per capita, at the time of the Roman Empire or the Han Dynasty in China. And then the evidence seems to be that per capita, the metabolism flattened out until around 1700. And societies were still increasing in energy usage, but any increase in energy usage or efficiency was balanced by an increase in population. And so, yes, there was a better way of farming that increased population. And one way of thinking about that is that the agricultural mode of life had reached some sort of planetary boundary, that ultimately agriculture is bounded by the amount of land available, and any small increases in efficiency were balanced by increases in population. And so that whole mode was reaching some sort of limit in terms of per capita metabolism. And then that began to change around 1700 with the access to this deep time energy. And what we see then is this per capita metabolism shooting off the scale. And we know as ecologists or as physicists or whatever we are, scientists, that figures like graphs like this cannot carry on forever in physical systems. Something has to constrain that exponential growth. And yet our economic model is built on the assumption that this is indefinitely sustainable. This is the model of the last century, and this is the model for the next century and the century after, increasing material growth, resource consumption as the key requirement of a prosperous and stable society. And that's, I think, the fundamental challenge of our time. So I think if we look at the calculations for a modern industrial society, here the UK, and the metabolism per capita in the UK is around 8,000 watts. Exactly how you measure it can change things. But now the UK supports a much higher population density than the 17th century agricultural society of around 260 watts per square metre. If we multiply those two numbers together, we get firstly, the natural ecosystem metabolism of the UK, if it was just the forest, the natural ecosystem is around 360 gigawatts. And the social metabolism of the people living in the UK is around 500 gigawatts. So there's more energy flowing through people in the UK than through the natural ecosystems of the UK. And so how is this possible? First, for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I said, we're not using the biosphere as our only source of energy. Fossil fuels initially, and now increasingly renewable energy and solar and those components become those sources of energy. And secondly, we import a lot of our energy flows from other parts of the world, food grown in other regions and materials grown that are imported into the UK. So it's a great quote from Margalef: "Technology allows us to use energy with little information to transform much and understand little." So let's go to the planetary scale. And so we could going back to those figures that I showed you at the start. Global land metabolism is around 150 terawatts of energy flow. If we look at the energy flow through all hunter-gatherer societies 10,000 years ago, it's a tiny fraction of biosphere energy flow. Half the area of Oxfordshire, which is a tiny fraction of the area of Catalonia, probably the area of the province of Barcelona, roughly, or something like that in terms of area. And if we go to pre-industrial, it's around 3 terawatts. So what I've done here, the big disk of the Earth is the energy flow of the biosphere. The small disk is the energy flow relatively in humanity, approximately. So you can see that red circle growing over time. And that's about the... if we go to 2010, we have the energy flow of humanity is around 25 terawatts, which is about 17% of the biosphere energy flow. So and that's roughly the energy flow of the Amazon rainforest. And so, which tells you something about how powerful the Amazon rainforest is as a biological entity, but also how significant humans are. If we go to a mid-level UN Development Programme projection, for 2050, the energy flow through all of humanity is the same as the energy flow through the world's tropical forests, the biological energy flow through the world's tropical forests, about 32% of biosphere energy flow. And if we go to a global China, which is very much a global Europe now in terms of per capita energy flow, we're at 40%. And then if we all go for Trump world and the American dream, if you have a global energy flow of the average North American average, we are at 120% of the energy flow through the biosphere. And whatever the source of the energy flow, we could make that dirtier or cleaner. That helps for sure, but our ability to change the biosphere around us is dominated by this large energy flow. And I would argue that this is perhaps the underlying challenge of the environment. Climate change and deforestation and habitat loss are all manifestations of this underlying challenges, how large our metabolism is relative to the metabolism of the living world. And reconciling that, I think, is the underlying environmental challenge on which all the more immediate challenges emerge from. So to give this a deep time perspective, I showed you this figure before of energy flow of the biosphere. So this mid-level UNDP scenario, that's the increase of energy flow. If we think of ourselves not as separate from the biosphere, but as simply an addition to the biosphere that's modifying the biosphere, changing its functions and forms, our energy flow is significant to the energy flow linked to the first colonization on land by the land plants, driven by a very similar process, access to a source of energy that was previously unavailable to the biosphere, and then channeling that energy through to modifying the biosphere. And then this is the global North America scenario. If we ignore any constraints on what this century brings, the transition is as large as the largest transitions in Earth history in terms of time scale. And these are transforming the biosphere in many ways, accelerating ecological processes, transforming ecosystems. And as Margalef said, man has become the greatest disturber of the biosphere, accelerating processes that nature performs slowly. And the one way that this is often characterized is in this idea of the Anthropocene, that we're moving into an age that's dominated by human presence. The geological definition of the Anthropocene has proved a bit controversial, but I think the concept of the Anthropocene is more important than ever. And if you think of that blue line as this metabolism, as this energy flow, you see this increasing human presence, and there's some debates about when the Anthropocene began. Was it linked in the mid-20th century? Was it the Industrial Revolution? Was it the megafaunal extinctions? Now, they're philosophical debates that can be helpful, but the story is one of this increasing human presence. So the challenge we face is that we have this large human metabolism entangled within the biosphere. And it's a nice smooth circle here, but really it's an 8 billion tentacled organism, with every individual human affecting the biosphere to different extents, and are very unequal in their effects on the biosphere. And this metabolism has effects on the biosphere. Resource depletion, it's a hungry metabolism, so it depletes resources, it overfishes, it overharvests. It produces waste products, CO2, that leads to climate change, ocean acidification, plastics, human industrial waste, and it occupies physical space that removes space for other fellow inhabitants of the biosphere. So deforestation, habitat loss, and species extinction are the consequence. So the challenges we face, one is thinking about how we can limit the size of this metabolism, so not to have a pathway of endless growth of this metabolism, I think has to be part of the solution. But the other one is also the more we can, which is the quantity of metabolism, but the other thing is also how much we can make this metabolism circular, so it draws on itself. It's renewing itself rather than drawing on the biosphere and pouring its waste into the biosphere. And that you can think of as renewable energy as one example of that, circular economy, recycling of nutrients and waste products as other elements. The more circular we make the metabolism, the less it draws on the biosphere and the less it pours into the biosphere. And one point that I made earlier, but I think it's always important to recognize, is that this increase in metabolism, at least in some parts of the world, has been linked to the great improvement in the state of humanity. And we are all here because our societies have a higher social metabolism than our ancestors did 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and the benefits we have from that. And so you see huge progress in poverty, in education, in health, in various ways. Democracy perhaps is not so good in the last few years here. But obviously it's unequal. This shouldn't be immediately only correlated. A lot of that increase in metabolism is also over consumption in other parts of the world that are disproportionately responsible for the effects we are having on the biosphere. It isn't. All these benefits are a relatively small part of account for a small part of the metabolism that is causing these challenges. My colleague Kate Rayworth frames this often in terms of this idea of a donut, where we need to somehow stay within these planetary boundaries while meet these basic human needs of education and health and food and these components, and trying to find this safe and just space where we meet human development needs while stay within the constraints of the planet. But I think there's also another way of framing this. I'll come back to this figure in a moment, which is, we can have this sustainability narrative, and I think that's important, but there's also another opportunity to recognize that we are part of the biosphere, and we can channel some of our abundant energy to restoring and protecting the biosphere, rather than just staying, not not damaging the biosphere further. I think it changes the storyline to being one of regenerating and flourishing with the biosphere rather than avoiding damage, plus recognizing our role in the biosphere. So we had a paper that came out a couple of months ago which tries to develop this narrative. And this is work that we're doing with the UN Human Development Programme, where we're trying to, but many of you will have heard of the Human Development Index as a measure of human development that looks at education and health and longevity as basic metrics. And that's hugely influential. Every year, the United Nations produces these metrics of how countries are in terms of their human development, which goes away from GDP and economic growth to the health of societies. So what we've been trying to do is also bring in a nature relationship metric alongside the human development metrics that looks at how societies are flourishing with their ecosystems, with their natural world. How much are they benefiting and restoring their ecosystems, so that every year that metric can sit alongside the development. So the definition of development expands to one that respects and flourishes with the living world, rather than is seen as this trade-off between development and nature. So we have this next year where we're trying to develop this metric and actually make it work, which is quite a challenge for overall. But that's the type of narrative we're trying to get away from, where we're not just staying within limits, but we're pouring our abundant energy to some extent into restoring the living world so that it is dynamic. So as Margalef said, our intelligence should help us integrate with the biosphere, not to dominate it. So I'll end with this figure, which this is actually from a paper I wrote about tropical forests, but I always like to have this one because I think it frames my thinking of where we are at a planetary scale in terms of our thinking, even though this figure is about tropical forests. And on the left, we have the biosphere of the past, the rich trophic interactions, complex ecosystems, and that biosphere is under pressure for multiple reasons, but in this case for tropical forests, one set of things are the global pressures, climate change, atmospheric change, causing effects, and that's that red belt tightening the biosphere. And the bottom we've got direct land use, land and forest use associated drivers. If you're thinking of other ecosystems like the ocean, you would have harvesting and other things in there as well. And so that biosphere is getting tighter. But I think there's every reason to believe that this isn't a one-way funnel to destruction, that actually there are global pressures that are beginning to shift the macro pressures over the next few decades. And those are population. We know all the models say that human population is probably going to peak sometime this century and then start declining. And secondly, the per capita consumption. The earlier signs are things are beginning to stabilize. The middle-income countries now are getting prosperous without increasing their consumption footprint. There's lots to do. There's no guarantee, no excuse for complacency. But these macro pressures, the tides may be beginning to retreat. And similarly, in forests, we're seeing this forest transition happening in many systems as well. But what emerges at the other end depends on how tight these bottlenecks of the early 21st century are. If we're really tight, what will emerge are very diminished ecosystems with little ecological function, an industrial biosphere, and we could actually have invertent consequences if excessive zeal to tackle climate change means turning much of the biosphere into biofuels or carbon capture systems. We could actually do more damage to the biosphere in trying to tackle climate change. So we have to make the right decisions. Or we can have functional ecosystems. Now, these are not going to be the ecosystems of the 19th century or the 10th century. Climate change alone means those ecosystems have changed. Invasive species, all of these other factors. But they could be ecologically vibrant ecosystems and functional ecosystems. Perhaps a little bit like those logged forests that I showed in Malaysia, that are full of ecological processes, even though they're different from the ecosystems of the past. So I think our collective challenge here, and particularly looking at the younger generation, and that'll carry us through to the mid-21st century and beyond, is to keep these bottlenecks as wide as possible now in terms of conservation and protection, but then also look beyond these bottlenecks to this nature recovery story. How do we start rebuilding a flourishing transformed but flourishing biosphere where both humanity and the rest of the living biosphere and life on Earth can thrive. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been an impressive presentation and synthesizing so many Margalef ideas too. So it's you were discovering Margalef, that is a very nice thing. Now we have a coffee break, but if any question emerge right now, we can have that. But otherwise, we will have later after the coffee break, we will have the opportunity to ask questions, not only to Yadvinder, but the other participants in this dialogue. Yes? Yeah, they are bringing the micro.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. It was excellent, and I enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. And recently, I read a paper of Jackson Group from Stanford University, which compared the energy per capita use in different countries with the different indexes of well-being, no? Like passionate, happiness, blah, 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 blah. A lot of indexes difference that related with the well-being of humans. And in this article, they show that if you increase, of course, if you increase the energy per capita, you increase all these indexes of well-being, but you arrive at the limit that this is not increased anymore. No? Combining of these indexes, we could try to make energy per capita ideal to look like the objective, yes. and to put this in a political level or a social level to convince people that yes. This is possible.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure the paper you refer to, but you see many plots of happiness, well-being against energy per capita or GDP, and you see the same pattern that it rises until about a middle income. So certainly, if you're in a poor country where your children are hungry and haven't got enough food to eat or access to healthcare, you're not happy. Things improve in happiness as you get that. But once you get to a certain level, you see very little increase in happiness for further energy per capita consumption. And I mean, you can see, look at the highest energy per capita consumptions now are in places like the US. And it's not a happy country, at the moment. And so there are other functions there, and you can see many countries that are more middle income have well-being. So I think part of it, and there's many other solutions. Part of it is how efficiently energy is used. You have some societies that are prosperous, but have really good transport infrastructure, health infrastructure, or you have very individualistic countries where things are used very inefficiently. So there are better ways to organize society and the information in society in ways that are more efficient. But certainly I think this narrative of endless growth is what we need for endless happiness is a narrative that's broken. And it's a big part of the challenge to find. I don't have all the answers. I'm not a good economist. But I think there are answers to be found in finding a narrative where you sustain prosperous societies, prosperous in terms of personal prosperity and meaning in life, while not having an indefinitely growing metabolic footprint. And I think that ultimately has to happen because we can't have that graph going like this. If either we as societies find a solution to that problem or the biosphere will find a solution to that problem in terms of feedbacks and other components there. So that is a problem we have to solve this century, one way or another.
Thank you for the talk. In the same sense, I think another important empirical evidence is in the rich countries, the level of equality is more connected with the mean empirical data of life expectation and health and other good things.
Yes.
It's more connected the level of equality than the GDP per capita, no? And
Yes.
I think it's that interesting way to interesting political fact.
Yes, absolutely. I think the evidence is very, very strong. The more equal the societies, the lower the metabolic footprint, the higher the level of happiness as well. So,
There is, for instance, a book, The Spirit Level of Wilkinson and Gate.
Okay.
It's an empirical study about correlations between GDP per capita and social indicators,
okay,
social
right.
and
Yes.
health indicators,
Yeah.
and the level of Gini index and so on, the level of economic inequality.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Now we have coffee break outside, so maybe we can awake a little bit in case someone. But I think the talk has been so much shocking ideas and to digest.